At 8:15 am on August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima ceased to exist as a functioning military and civilian center. One aircraft, one bomb, less than 1 minute. In a blinding flash, temperatures at ground zero reached levels hotter than the surface of the sun. Buildings vaporized. Human beings were reduced to shadows burned into stone. Communications stopped instantly. Rail lines vanished. Hospitals collapsed. Tens of thousands were killed before they could even understand what was happening. And for hours afterward, Japan's high command did not believe it. Not because they were uninformed, not because they were unaware of destruction, but because what had happened did not fit any category they were prepared to accept. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters received fragmented reports shortly after the attack. Hiroshima had gone dark. Radio contact was lost. Reconnaissance aircraft sent to investigate reported a city covered by a massive cloud and widespread devastation beyond anything previously recorded. But destruction alone was not new to Japan. By August 1945, Japanese cities had been burning for months. Tokyo itself had been devastated by conventional firebombing in March. Over 100,000 civilians had died in a single night. Dozens of cities had been reduced to ashes by B-29 raids. From the perspective of senior military leaders, Hiroshima initially looked like another air raid, perhaps unusually severe, but not fundamentally different. This assumption would shape one of the most consequential refusals in modern history. Japan's Supreme War Council, the body responsible for deciding whether the war would continue or end, did not convene immediately after Hiroshima. There was no emergency session, no instant recognition that the rules of war had changed. Instead, the High Command debated a familiar question: how many bombers had attacked? Initial estimates varied wildly. Some officers suggested a large-scale raid had occurred. Others argued it must have been a new type of incendiary bomb. The idea that one aircraft had destroyed an entire city was dismissed outright. That idea was unacceptable. The Japanese military had built its entire strategic worldview around endurance. It believed Japan could survive punishment longer than its enemies could sustain political will. Cities could burn, civilians could die. As long as the Imperial Army remained intact, the war could continue. Hiroshima did not immediately challenge that belief. What truly unsettled the High Command was not the destruction itself, but the implication that Japan might no longer control the pace or scale of its own destruction. That implication was resisted fiercely. When scientists within Japan's research community warned that the United States might possess an atomic weapon, many senior officers dismissed the idea as propaganda. Japan had attempted to pursue nuclear research itself and understood the theoretical difficulty. They believed such a weapon was impractical, unreliable, and likely exaggerated. To admit otherwise would be to admit strategic failure at the deepest level. Throughout August 6th and into August 7th, reports continued to arrive. The scale of devastation defied conventional explanation. Survivors described a single flash followed by a blast that leveled entire districts. Medical officers reported radiation sickness symptoms they could not explain, burns without fire, illness without wounds. Still, the High Command hesitated, acknowledging that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a fundamentally new weapon would force a reckoning they were not prepared to face. If the United States could destroy cities at will, with single bombs, then Japan's strategy of attrition was meaningless. The war would no longer be about endurance. It would be about annihilation, and that was a reality Japan's military leadership refused to accept. Instead, they focused on what they still believed they controlled. The Imperial Army remained largely intact. Millions of soldiers were positioned across the home islands in Asia. Plans for a decisive homeland defense were already underway. The belief persisted that one catastrophic blow, no matter how severe, did not determine the outcome of a war. This belief was not ignorance, it was doctrine. Japan's high command had been shaped by decades of military culture that valued sacrifice over surrender. Losses were expected. Catastrophe was endured. Victory in this worldview did not require survival of cities. It required preservation of honor and the ability to inflict enough pain to force negotiation. Hiroshima challenged that worldview, but it did not yet shatter it. Even when American broadcasts announced that an atomic bomb had been used, skepticism remained. Some officers believed the claim was psychological warfare designed to force surrender through fear. Others argued that even if such a weapon existed, it could not be used repeatedly. They were wrong on both counts, but on August 6th and 7th, Japan's high command clung to uncertainty as a shield. As long as doubt remained, so did justification for delay, and delay had become the central strategy. Every hour without surrender preserved internal cohesion. Every day allowed military leaders to hope for better terms, Soviet mediation, or a final decisive battle that could reshape negotiations. The refusal to accept Hiroshima's meaning was not passive. It was deliberate, and it would soon collide with reality in a way no one in Tokyo could control. By the morning of August 7, 1945, the physical reality of Hiroshima was no longer in doubt. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that the city had been almost entirely destroyed. Military observers reported devastation on a scale previously unseen even after months of firebombing. Survivors staggered through the ruins carrying injuries that made no sense within existing medical knowledge. Yet the political and military response in Tokyo remained paralyzed. The reason lay inside the structure of Japan's decision-making system itself. Japan's Supreme War Council, often referred to as the Big Six, was evenly divided by design. 3 members represented the military hardliners: the Army Minister, the Chief of the Army General Staff, and the Chief of the Navy General Staff. 3 others represented more pragmatic voices: the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and the Navy Minister. Any decision required consensus. Without it, nothing moved forward. This system did not exist to facilitate quick decisions. It existed to prevent them. In the hours after Hiroshima, that structure worked exactly as intended, by delaying action. The civilian leadership, particularly Foreign Minister Shigenori Tai, grasped the gravity of what had happened faster than most. He understood that Hiroshima was not simply another destroyed city. It represented a weapon that bypassed Japan's entire defensive strategy. No amount of bravery, no final battle on the beaches, could stop a bomb that fell from the sky and erased a city in seconds. But Taug did not control the army. The military leadership fixated on a different set of questions. Could the Americans produce more of these weapons? Had Hiroshima been a singular experiment? Could Japan still absorb a limited number of such attacks and continue fighting? These were not academic questions. They were excuses to delay the one decision the military did not want to face: surrender. Within the Army General Staff, denial hardened into doctrine. Senior officers argued that the atomic bomb, while destructive, did not directly destroy Japan's fighting forces. The Imperial Army remained largely intact. Millions of soldiers were still deployed across the home islands, China and Southeast Asia. As long as the army existed, they argued, Japan could still negotiate from a position of strength. This argument deliberately ignored the political reality. Japan was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to control the terms of defeat. The military strategy hinged on one last hope: Soviet mediation. Despite clear warning signs, Japan's high command clung to the belief that the Soviet Union might broker a negotiated settlement with the United States. The Soviets had remained neutral toward Japan under the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. Japanese leaders convinced themselves that Stalin might intervene diplomatically to secure better surrender terms, perhaps preservation of the imperial system, perhaps avoidance of occupation. This belief was dangerously outdated. Unknown to Japan's leadership, the Soviet Union had already committed to entering the war against Japan. At the Yalta Conference, Stalin had promised to attack Japan 3 months after Germany's surrender. That deadline was approaching fast, but Japan's high command either did not know or refused to accept that reality. Instead of responding decisively to Hiroshima, they doubled down on diplomatic delay. Messages were sent to Moscow. Appeals were drafted, time was wasted. Inside the Supreme War Council, debates dragged on without resolution. Military leaders demanded proof that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. Scientists were summoned to analyze reports. Committees were formed. Meanwhile, American B-29s continued flying overhead. The refusal to accept Hiroshima's meaning was no longer just denial. It was institutional paralysis. Even as evidence mounted, the Army's leadership clung to a final illusion: that the atomic bomb was a psychological weapon designed to frighten Japan into surrender. They argued that the United States would not possess many such bombs. Even if another were used, Japan could endure it. This was not bravery, it was miscalculation. While Tokyo debated, American forces prepared the second atomic bomb. The decision had already been made. The target list was finalized. Japan's high command still did not act. On August 8th, the situation deteriorated further. Soviet forces prepared to launch a massive offensive into Manchuria. Japan's Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Army, was poorly equipped, undermanned, and unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. The High Command knew this, yet even as intelligence hinted at Soviet mobilization, the military leadership continued to prioritize delay. Surrender, they believed, would be worse than annihilation. To accept defeat under American terms alone was unthinkable. They were gambling the nation's survival on the hope that events might somehow shift in their favor. That gamble would fail catastrophically. In retrospect, historians would identify this moment, the refusal to accept Hiroshima's true meaning, as the final strategic failure of Imperial Japan. The bomb did not end the war immediately because Japan's leaders refused to let it. They chose uncertainty over clarity, delay over decision, doctrine over reality. And in doing so, they guaranteed that the next shock would be even worse. In the early hours of August 9, 1945, the world that Japan's High Command believed it still controlled collapsed completely. At 12:01 am, Soviet forces launched a massive, coordinated invasion of Manchuria. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops surged across the border, supported by armor, artillery, and air power. The assault was overwhelming in both scale and speed. Japanese defensive positions crumbled almost immediately. The Kwantung Army, once considered one of Japan's strongest formations, disintegrated under pressure it had no means to resist. This was the moment Japan's final strategic illusion died. For months, the High Command had clung to the belief that the Soviet Union might act as a mediator. That hope had justified delay after Hiroshima. It had allowed military leaders to argue that surrender was premature, that diplomacy still offered an alternative to unconditional defeat. Now the Soviets were no longer potential intermediaries. They were enemies. And worse, they were advancing rapidly toward territory Japan could not afford to lose: Korea, Manchuria, Sakhalin, and potentially even northern Japan itself. The war had expanded in the worst possible direction. As reports of the Soviet invasion reached Tokyo, panic spread through the upper levels of government. The Supreme War Council convened again. This time the atmosphere was different. The argument was no longer theoretical. Japan now faced the prospect of occupation not by one enemy, but by two, and one of them was the Soviet Union. Even then, consensus did not emerge. The military hardliners argued that Japan could still fight on. They proposed a strategy of national sacrifice, mobilizing civilians, inflicting massive casualties during an Allied invasion, and forcing the United States to negotiate. The loss of Manchuria, they argued, was tragic but not decisive. What they still refused to accept was that Japan had already lost control of events. That refusal was shattered only hours later. At 11:02 am on August 9th, a second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki. Once again, a single aircraft destroyed a city. Once again, tens of thousands died instantly. But unlike Hiroshima, Nagasaki could not be dismissed as an anomaly. 2 cities destroyed by 2 bombs in 3 days erased any remaining argument that the atomic weapon was experimental, symbolic, or rare. Japan now faced a future in which annihilation could be repeated at will. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Within the Supreme War Council, positions began to shift. The Navy leadership, already aware that Japan's maritime power had collapsed, concluded that continued resistance was meaningless. Foreign Minister Togi argued forcefully that Japan must accept surrender before the nation ceased to exist. Still, the army refused to yield. The council deadlocked once again. This was the final failure of Japan's military leadership. The system they had built, designed to prevent rash decisions, now prevented survival. Doctrine, honor, and fear of humiliation had become more important than the lives of millions. At this point, something unprecedented occurred. Emperor Hirohito intervened. Until this moment, the emperor had remained above politics, a symbolic figure whose wishes were interpreted rather than stated. But the scale of catastrophe had forced his hand. He listened as the council presented its arguments. He heard the military's insistence on continued resistance. He heard the civilians' warnings of annihilation. And then he spoke. The emperor stated that Japan must accept surrender. Not because it was honorable, not because it was negotiable, but because the war could no longer be fought without destroying the nation itself. This intervention broke the deadlock. The High Command had refused to accept Hiroshima. They had refused to accept Soviet entry. They had even resisted Nagasaki. But they could not refuse the emperor. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. In his radio address to the nation, Emperor Hirohito did not mention defeat in conventional terms. Instead, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, whose power threatened the survival of civilization itself. The phrasing was deliberate. It acknowledged the atomic bomb's role without assigning blame or dwelling on military failure. The refusal that had defined Japan's response to Hiroshima was finally over. But the cost of that refusal was staggering. Hundreds of thousands were dead. 2 cities were obliterated. The Soviet Union occupied vast territories Japan would never recover. The nation surrendered under harsher terms than might have been possible days earlier. History would later debate whether Japan would have surrendered after Hiroshima alone. But what is undeniable is this: Japan's High Command refused to accept what Hiroshima meant when it still had a choice. They believed endurance could overcome technology. They believed honor could outweigh reality. They believed delay might produce better outcomes. Instead, delay ensured the worst possible ending. Hiroshima was not ignored because Japan's leaders were blind. It was ignored because accepting it required abandoning everything they believed war, and Japan itself, stood for. By the time reality could no longer be denied, it was too late to control the outcome. That is what Japan's High Command refused to accept after Hiroshima. And it is why the war ended not with negotiation, but with surrender.